Ah yes, Grendel. This Warframe eats enemies and then uses them as fuel for buffs and potentially as fuel for murder. Grendel's passive gives you armor for each enemy in your stomach. That being said, Grendel already has solid base armor and very good base health, so this doesn't change whether Grendel is tanky or not. It just means you will be getting some bonus armor while a lot of enemies are in your stomach. But having a lot of enemies in your stomach drains a lot of energy. So while the effectiveness of this passive will vary depending on how you build and play Grendel, it's not likely to provide a huge bonus that much of the time. You get enemies in your stomach using Grendel's first ability, Feast. You tap the button, and then you can mouse your cursor over enemies, and you'll suck them in, and if you don't suck in an enemy for a few seconds, the ability will automatically cancel. Then you start draining energy. These enemies in your stomach are losing a % of their armor based on your strength every second, and you also drain energy for each enemy in your stomach every second. You drain more energy for every second they've been in your stomach. So over time you drain a ton of energy, and eventually you're going to run out, at which time you puke them all out. As you can see, they take a ton of toxin damage based on their level it scales, and they also get a toxin status effect guaranteed, so they're very likely to simply die. If they have no armor and they get scaling toxin damage with a toxin status effect for damage over time, as you can see, some high-level enemies will pretty handily simply die from that effect. You can also puke them back up early by holding the ability button down if you don't want to lose all of your energy. Grendel's second ability allows you to gain buffs. You need enemies in your stomach to activate a buff. There are 3 different buffs, and you can have them all active at the same time, and they can also affect allies within range based on your range stat. Finally, when you use one of the buffs, you damage an enemy in your stomach and you heal a little bit. The 3 buffs are Nourished Energy. This is an energy gain multiplier. Based on your strength, you get more energy from all sources. Ooh, a way to gain more energy that is not based on efficiency. Very spicy. However, because you need to get this buff by having an enemy in your stomach, you will have an enemy in your stomach at the beginning of your time having the buff, meaning you can't regenerate energy because you're using a channeled ability, Feast, with the enemy in your stomach. If you puke the enemy out, you can benefit from that, and it still works on stuff like energy orbs, so a pretty solid effect overall. Nourished Armor. This implies it gives you some kind of defensive buff, and it doesn't. Instead, when you take damage or kill an enemy, you create a toxin explosion with that damage and that radius. Pretty good radius, the damage is very low, and it doesn't scale with enemy level like some other forms of Grendel's damage, so that's pretty weak. Now, it says on the wiki that this can stagger enemies. And in my memory, I remember playing Grendel, using this ability after finding that out and seeing enemies get staggered. But off camera, I tested that a lot before recording this, and I could not get it to happen. I couldn't get it to happen in the Simulacrum, I couldn't get it to happen in missions, I couldn't get it to happen against different kinds of enemies. So this is either really inconsistent, broken, or just not real and somehow got mixed up in there. So I don't know what to tell you. If that was a thing, it would be valuable. I can't confirm that it actually works. Finally, we have Nourished Strike. It says it's a damage multiplier. It's an elemental damage multiplier. So when you have a damage multiplier, you want to know, is it separate from your other multipliers, or is it adding to something you already have? This is elemental damage. 50% elemental damage modified by strength. That's pretty nice. Imagine that you add a 9th mod slot to your weapons, and in that mod slot goes a 50% toxin damage mod. This will combine with your other elements. Again, it will be last in your modding. Your weapons will gain, maybe more of the toxin elemental combo they have, maybe more viral, more corrosive, or maybe they have radiation and they will gain toxin on top of that. Pretty solid. A lot of elemental damage buffs start at a higher value, but then again, a lot of them come from augment mods, and this one doesn't. Oh boy. So Nourish is also the ability that Grendel shares through the Helminth system. However, he shares a modified version of it. You only get to use Nourished Strike, and there are also some differences because you don't eat enemies as another Warframe. And it's also complicated because, as you can see, the entire tooltip has just been copy-pasted here. You do not get to use Nourished Energy and Nourished Armor. You will not damage an enemy in your stomach because there will not be one in there. And you don't need to eat an enemy because you can't. So that's nice. You can activate this just as a heal, although it's a pretty small heal. And other Warframes using this can gain the Nourished Strike damage multiplier at will. It still affects squad mates, that's nice, but you can't use Nourished Energy or Nourished Armor. Ignore the tooltip. I guess the altered thing kind of describes it. Regurgitate is Grendel's third ability. This lets you shoot one enemy out of your stomach as a projectile. It does damage to enemies in a radius. It can proc toxin status effects, and it also scales with enemy level. Now, these enemies are high-level armored enemies, so as you can see, with no outside help, it's not doing very significant damage. But against smaller enemies, against a lot of the enemies in a given radius, those enemies are going to die. This ability does pretty good damage. And again, it doesn't cost energy. Of course, having enemies in your stomach does cost energy. A lot of the time, for the enemies in your stomach, this is not more effective than simply keeping them in your stomach, but it does cost less energy, and it damages enemies outside of your stomach. They go pretty far. It's a pretty fast casting ability. You can also use this to maybe reduce the number of enemies in your stomach for some reason. You can spit them off the map so they die. There's all sorts of little uses for this weapon, but overall it is that. It's a weapon. It's kind of like adding an explosive weapon to your loadout that is powered by your stomach. Not bad, but not necessarily something to focus on in Grendel's kit. Finally, we have the Meatball. This is Pulverize, Grendel's fourth ability, and it requires enemies in your stomach, and then you can morph into this roller pinball thing that does damage to enemies you collide with based on your speed. Once you're in this mode, enemies in your stomach take damage over time, and if they die, you can stay in it, but you start to drain a ton of energy. And remember that you do drain energy with an enemy in your stomach as well, which means although this ability has no innate cost, unless you run out of enemies in your stomach, in practice, it's going to cost a lot of energy, because you either have enemies in your stomach, meaning that costs energy, or because you don't have enemies in your stomach, in which case the ability starts to cost energy. You can jump, but you can't perform a bunch of parkour maneuvers, and the control is a little weird. You can use Nourish to get a speed boost. It's not hugely significant, but that is a thing that you can do. Personally, I feel that this ability is not particularly worth the time if you strictly want to damage enemies efficiently, but it does have pretty good theoretical base damage, and it does have a lot of multipliers too. It is scaling with enemy level. It does scale based on your speed. It scales based on your strength. Those are all powerful things, and it even scales with the amount of enemies in your stomach. You do more damage if you have a lot of enemies in your stomach. If you could somehow get all of that working at once, theoretically the damage is there, but personally I haven't been utterly convinced, as you can probably tell. Now there's more to say about Grendel's abilities, but here I focused on the information I think you'll use in practice, not every single bit of information. There are things about these abilities I did not tell you, but after spending a lot of time playing Grendel, I sincerely believe that you do not need to know that information immediately to have fun with this Warframe. If you want to know it, you should check the wiki. That's also a great place to find out how to get Grendel. Now that I've talked to you about Grendel's basics and what I think about them, I'd like to entice you with some builds. Behold, these are fashion frame appearances that correspond to the Grendel appearances that I'm going to use in my other Grendel build videos. The catch is that one of them is a complete meme. If you're from the past, I hope you'll enjoy trying to guess what each of these builds might be, which one of them might be a bit silly. And if you're from the future, you can find each of the builds that corresponds to these appearances linked in the description or in the card marked as a spoiler. And I hope that you enjoy them very much. I know I did. As you can see, I had a lot of fun with Grendel fashion specifically. Grendel has very few cosmetics, so it was a time. I feel a little bad for Grendel. I think this is a Warframe that is mechanically complicated, but not functionally very complex or necessarily interesting to a lot of people. There's a lot of ins and outs to feast and nourish and pulverize, and your reward for all of that is an okay generalist. But I think that Grendel does have some unique stuff going on, and there are quite a few frames that are popular that are basically just really, really tanky, and they don't do much else. Grendel does do a few other things that are pretty valuable, especially the little smorgasbord of buffs. So I'm really excited to talk more about this Warframe, and I hope you're excited to hear about him. Thanks for watching. See you next time.